It is late 1944. The roads to Germany are paved with freezing mud and the shattered hulls of American machinery. In the command tent of the Third Army, a report lands on a wooden desk. General George S.Patton picks it up. He reads it, and he explodes. His tank crews were disobeying him. They were terrified. They were dying. And in a desperate bid to survive the lethal high-velocity guns of the German Wehrmacht, American crews had started turning their M4 Shermans into moving fortresses. They welded scrap metal to the hull. They poured feet of concrete onto the front glacis. They stacked hundreds of sandbags over the transmission covers. They created Frankenstein tanks designed to stop a tiger shell. But when Patton saw these modifications, he didn't see ingenuity. He didn't see survival. He saw cowardice, and he saw a mechanical disaster waiting to happen. He issued an order that sent a shockwave through the ranks. He ordered the men to strip the armor off. Was Patton a callous butcher who didn't care about his men's lives, or was he the only one who understood the physics of tank warfare? Did these illegal upgrades actually save lives, or did they turn the M4 Sherman into a slow, overstressed death trap that got more men killed than it saved? Today, we are opening the classified files on the sandbag war. We are going inside the mechanics, the ballistics, and the psychology of the men who defied one of the scariest generals in American history just to survive one more day. To understand why a tank crew would risk court-martial to weld garbage to their vehicle, you first have to understand the terror of sitting inside an M4 Sherman in 1944. On paper, the Sherman was a marvel of engineering. It was reliable, it was easy to repair, and it had a powered traverse turret that could spin faster than anything the Germans had. It was the workhorse of democracy. But to the men inside, the 19-year-old kid from Kansas driving, the mechanic from Brooklyn loading the gun, the Sherman had a different name. They called it the Ronson. Lights first time, every time. That was the joke. But nobody was laughing. By late 1944, the illusion of American armored superiority had been shattered. In North Africa, the Sherman had been a king, but in the hedgerows of Normandy and the forests of the Ardennes, the Sherman was prey. The German Panther and Tiger tanks carried high-velocity guns, the 75mm KWK-42 and the terrifying 88mm KWK-36. Let's look at the math that kept American tank commanders awake at night. A standard M4 Sherman had 51mm of frontal armor, sloped at 56 degrees. Effectively, it gave it about 90mm of protection. Against a Panzer IV, that was decent. Against a Tiger, it was tissue paper. A German 88mm shell could punch through the front of a Sherman at 2,000 yards. That's over a mile away. You wouldn't even see the muzzle flash before you were dead. You sit in there and you know you're sitting on 60 shells and 150 gallons of high-octane gasoline. You know that if a Kraut puts a round through the final drive, the whole thing goes up like a Roman candle. You don't get out, you fry. This was the reality. The Ronson burn rate was a scandal. Early Shermans had dry ammunition storage. When a shell penetrated the armor, it would ignite the propellant in the stored shells. The tank didn't just break, it incinerated. The Army tried to fix this with wet stowage, jacketing the ammo racks in water mixed with antifreeze, but the reputation stuck. The crews felt naked. They felt like they'd been sent to fight lions with a pocket knife. And when human beings feel defenseless, they get creative. And that creativity began to manifest in the strangest ways across the European theater. It started small. A crew would weld a few spare track links to the front of the tank. It made sense, right? Steel is steel. If you add an inch of track link to 2 inches of armor, you get 3 inches of protection. But fear is a powerful motivator, and soon, small modifications spiraled out of control. The most common modification was the sandbag. It was easy. Infantry used sandbags to stop bullets, so why couldn't a tank use them to stop shells? Crews would weld metal cages, frames made of rebar or stolen fencing to the front and sides of their Sherman. Into these cages, they would stack hundreds of sandbags. We aren't talking about a few bags. We are talking about covering the entire front glacis, the transmission housing, and sometimes the turret cheeks. Then, there was the concrete. Yes, concrete. Crews would raid captured French construction sites or bombed-out basements. They would mix cement and pour it directly onto the front of the tank, sometimes up to 6 inches thick. Imagine the sight of this. A column of American tanks, but they don't look like machines anymore. They look like rolling boulders. They look like prehistoric beasts caked in mud and stone. Even the legends did it. Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams, the man the modern M1 Abrams tank is named after, was a believer in up-armoring. His tank, Thunderbolt, was famous for the extra steel plates welded to its hull. But for the average crew, without access to high-grade steel plates, they used what they had: wood. Logs were strapped to the sides to disrupt shaped charges. Panzerfausts and Panzerschrecks, the German bazookas, used a shaped charge warhead. The idea was that the log would detonate the warhead early, inches away from the steel, causing the jet of molten metal to dissipate before it could penetrate the crew compartment. It was primitive, it was ugly, it was unauthorized, but to the boys inside, it felt like safety. It felt like they were doing something to tip the scales. But there was a problem. A big mechanical problem that the 19-year-old kid in the driver's seat didn't account for. The M4 Sherman was a finely tuned machine. Its engine, typically a Ford GAA V8 or a Chrysler Multibank, was designed to move a 33-ton vehicle. The suspension, the vertical volute spring suspension, was calibrated for that weight. When you add 150 sandbags to the front of a tank, you aren't just adding decoration, you are adding weight. A lot of weight. Let's do the math. A standard sandbag weighs about 40 to 50 pounds. If you stack 200 of them on your tank, you are adding nearly 10,000 pounds. That's 5 tons. If you pour concrete, it gets even worse. Some of these field modifications added 7 to 8 tons of dead weight to the front of the vehicle. The Sherman became front-heavy. The center of gravity shifted forward. This compressed the front bogie wheels to their limit. The springs bottomed out. This meant the tank lost its suspension travel. Every bump in the road wasn't absorbed by the springs. It was transferred directly into the chassis. The ride became bone-shattering. But worse than the comfort was the strain on the transmission. The Sherman's final drives were tough, but they weren't magical. Trying to rotate that extra mass, especially in deep mud, shredded the gears. Engines overheated, clutches burned out. In the autumn of 1944, as the rains turned Europe into a swamp, sandbagged Shermans began to break down at an alarming rate. They weren't being knocked out by German guns, they were knocking themselves out. A tank that can't move is just a pillbox with a target painted on it. And this is where General Patton enters the story. General George S. Patton commanded the Third Army. He was a cavalryman at heart. His philosophy of war was simple: attack, attack, and then attack some more. Patton believed in speed. He believed that the best armor was not steel, but mobility. If you're moving fast, the enemy can't hit you. If you are flanking the enemy, his frontal armor doesn't matter. Patton's doctrine relied on the Sherman's reliability. He needed his tanks to cover 50, 60, sometimes 70 miles in a day to exploit breakthroughs. So imagine his reaction when he inspects a tank battalion and sees his sleek cavalry horses turned into sluggish, concrete-covered turtles. There's a famous account of Patton encountering a tank unit from the 14th Armored Division. He walks down the line, his riding crop tapping against his leg. He stops at a tank covered in sandbags. He turns to the commander and asks, "What is this?" The commander stammers, "It's for protection, General. The men, they feel safer." Patton's face goes purple. He screams, "I don't care what they feel. I care if they can fight. These are tanks, not bunkers." Patton issued a directive. He banned the use of sandbags. He ordered that they be removed immediately. He threatened court-martials for commanders who allowed their men to weigh down their machines. He argued that the sandbags strained the engines, wasted fuel, and most importantly, they slowed the tanks down. A slow tank is an easy target. By trying to protect themselves, Patton argued, the men were actually making themselves easier to kill. To understand just how crushing this order was, we have to look at the personal account of a sergeant from the 47th Tank Battalion, 14th Armored Division. The date is late January 1945. The unit is holding the line near the Modder River. It is 10 degrees below zero. The men have spent 3 sleepless days scavenging rebar and chicken wire to build cages for their tanks. They have packed them tight with frozen sand. They are exhausted, but they are proud. They think they have finally built a shield that can stop a German shell. The sergeant writes, "We heard the general was coming. We lined up the tanks. We stood at attention. We thought he'd be proud of us. We thought he'd see that we were trying to win his war without getting blown to hell." Patton pulled up in his Jeep. He didn't smile. He didn't salute. He walked up to the lead tank, my tank. He looked at the sandbags. He looked at the logs, and then he kicked the hull. He looked me right in the eye and screamed, "I don't want my men looking like a bunch of goddamn rag pickers. You look like a refugee caravan. You are American soldiers, not junk dealers. Get that crap off my tanks right now." Rag pickers. That was the word that broke them. The sergeant continues, "It took us 4 hours to cut the cages off. We had to use cutting torches. The metal was screaming. And the boys, some of them were crying, not because they were sad, but because they were terrified. As we shoved those heavy sandbags off the hull into the mud, we felt like we were stripping ourselves naked. We knew the next time we saw a tiger, there would be nothing between us and the 88 but a half-inch of American steel." This wasn't just a disagreement about mechanics. This was a psychological execution. Patton stripped away their security blanket and told them to rely on courage alone. And for a 19-year-old kid facing the Wehrmacht, courage offers very little protection against high-explosive anti-tank rounds. But here's the twist. Here's the question that historians have debated for 80 years. Was Patton right? Not just about the engines, was he right about the protection? Did those sandbags actually stop German shells? Or was it all a lie the soldiers told themselves to keep from going insane? To answer this, we have to look at the physics of a shaped charge and a kinetic penetrator. The German Panzerfaust used a shaped charge, a jet of superplastic metal. The theory was that sandbags would trigger the warhead early, creating a standoff distance. The jet would form in the air, travel through the sand, and dissipate before hitting the steel. In theory, this works. Modern tanks use slat armor or cage armor for this exact reason. But in 1944, the physics didn't favor the American GI. Tests conducted by the US Army later in the war revealed a horrifying truth. Sandbags didn't help. In many cases, it made it worse. For kinetic rounds, solid metal slugs fired by tanks, the sandbags offered zero protection. But for the shaped charges, the sandbags actually helped the German weapon. Most German-shaped charges were optimized to detonate at a specific distance from the armor. But early Panzerfausts sometimes detonated too close to the hull for the jet to form perfectly. By adding a layer of sandbags, the Americans were accidentally providing the perfect standoff distance for the German warheads. The sandbags held the warhead at the optimal distance for the jet to focus, allowing it to punch deeper into the steel than if the sandbags hadn't been there at all. Furthermore, the extra weight changed the angle of the tank. A Sherman is designed to sit level. When the tank is weighed down by concrete, the nose dips. This reduces the effective slope of the armor. Instead of hitting a 56-degree slope, the German shell hits a 50-degree slope. It becomes easier to penetrate. Patton, whether he knew the complex ballistics or just used his intuition, was right. The armor was a placebo. It was a security blanket made of dirt. To understand why a crew would pile 5 tons of concrete onto their vehicle, you have to understand the sound of death in 1944. Veterans of the European theater didn't talk about the sight of a Tiger tank as much as they talked about the sound of being hunted by one, or rather, the lack of it. The German 88mm fired a shell at nearly 800 meters per second. That is Mach 2.3, more than twice the speed of sound. This creates a terrifying physical phenomenon known as the crack thump. If a Tiger fires at you from 1 kilometer away, the physics of survival break down. First, the shell arrives. It covers the distance in 1.2 seconds. It screams past your turret with a high-pitched, tearing shriek like a bedsheet being ripped in half by a giant. That is the shock wave of the air being displaced by a solid steel slug moving at supersonic speed. You hear the crack right over your head. That's the air splitting. If you hear the crack, you're alive. It means he missed. Then, a full 2 seconds after the shell has already passed you, you hear the thump, the dull, distant boom of the Tiger's cannon firing. Think about that timeline. You were already dead before the sound of the gun that killed you even arrives. There is no warning. There is just existence, and then oblivion. And when that shell hits, when it strikes the steel plate of a Sherman, it transfers 2.5 million joules of energy in a fraction of a millisecond. The sound is not an explosion, it is a bell. Survivors describe it as being inside a giant church bell that has been struck by Thor's hammer. The impact is so violent, it spalls the armor on the inside. Even if the shell doesn't penetrate, the shockwave knocks flakes of razor-sharp steel off the interior wall, turning the inside of the turret into a blender. Now look at those sandbags again. Against 2.5 million joules of kinetic energy, a bag of wet dirt offers about as much resistance as a sheet of paper. The shell doesn't get stuck in the sand. It doesn't slow down. It passes through the sandbag in 0.0001 seconds. The crews knew this deep down, but when you're sitting in a metal box, waiting for a supersonic crack that you can't hear coming, you'll pile anything between you and the enemy. You aren't building armor. You're building a psychological wall to hide from the physics of Mach 2. If the physics were so clear, if the sandbags were useless and the extra weight was suicidal, why did the crews insist on doing it? Why does the popular history of World War II remember the Sherman tank as a Ronson, a death trap that burst into flames if you looked at it wrong? The answer lies largely with one man, a man whose job was so horrific it colored our understanding of the war for decades. His name was Belton Cooper. He wasn't a tank commander. He wasn't a general. He was a liaison officer for the 3rd Armored Division's Maintenance Battalion. Cooper's job was not to fight in the tanks. His job was to clean them up after they had been destroyed. Every time a Sherman was knocked out, Cooper was the one sent to retrieve it. He was the one who had to hose out the remains of the crew. He was the one who had to count the penetrations. Day after day, for months, Cooper saw nothing but failure. He saw nothing but burned steel and dead Americans. In his memoir, Death Traps, Cooper painted a picture of the Sherman as a criminally negligent piece of garbage. His book became the Bible for the Sherman was trash narrative. But historians today call this survivorship bias, or in Cooper's case, mortality bias. Cooper only saw the tanks that died. He didn't see the thousands of Shermans that flanked the enemy, won the battle, and drove on to the next town. He didn't see the tanks that bounced shots and kept fighting. His entire reality was filtered through the lens of the salvage yard. The statistical reality stands in sharp contrast to Cooper's nightmare. The M4 Sherman actually had one of the highest crew survival rates of the war. On average, when a Sherman was penetrated, only one crew member was killed and one wounded. The other three usually bailed out. Compare that to the Russian T-34, where a penetration usually meant the death of the entire crew due to spalling and cramped conditions. But stats didn't matter to the men on the ground. The men on the ground saw what Cooper saw. They saw the burning wrecks. They heard the rumors. The Cooper perspective became the soldier's reality. It was this specific terror, the belief that their equipment was inferior, that drove them to the scrap piles. They weren't just welding on sandbags to stop shells. They were trying to fix a machine they had lost faith in. Patton saw the macro statistics. The tank is fine, keep moving. The crews saw the micro horror. My buddy burned to death yesterday. I need concrete. And this clash of perspectives brings us to the irony of the situation. Because while the crews were trying to build their own heavy tanks out of garbage, the Army actually had a solution waiting in the wings. Patton wasn't against all armor. He was against bad armor. While he was screaming at crews to take off the sandbags, the Army was rolling out the solution, the M4A3E2 Jumbo Sherman. The Jumbo was a factory-built beast. It had an extra inch of steel welded to the front and a massive new turret. It was designed properly. The suspension was tweaked, the gear ratios were adjusted. The Jumbo could take a hit from an 88mm and keep rolling. When Patton got Jumbos, he loved them. He put them at the front of every column. This proves that Patton wasn't a maniac who wanted his men to be vulnerable. He was a professional who despised amateur solutions that compromised the fighting ability of his army. But there is one factor that numbers, ballistics, and General Patton couldn't account for: the human mind. Even after Patton's orders, crews continued to sneak sandbags onto their tanks. They would cover them with camouflage nets to hide from the general's inspections. Why? Because in war, morale is as important as ammunition. If a crew believed the concrete would save them, they were more likely to be aggressive. They were less likely to hesitate. And in a tank duel, he who shoots first usually lives. The sandbags might have been physically useless. They might have been mechanically dangerous, but they provided psychological armor. They allowed terrified boys to drive into the teeth of the German defense. General Patton won the war in Europe by moving faster than the enemy could react. His refusal to let his army get bogged down, literally and figuratively, was a key factor in the collapse of the Third Reich. He was technically right. The sandbags were a trap. But looking back at the photos of those Frankenstein tanks, we shouldn't judge the crews who built them. We should simply recognize the desperation of men asking for just one more inch of steel between them and the end of the world. Patton hated it. The physics didn't support it. But for the men of the Third Army, that dirt and concrete was the only thing that let them sleep at night. What would you have done? Would you listen to the general and trust the speed? Or would you stack the sandbags and pray they hold? Let us know in the comments below.